Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 31 of Series 7. The question for today is, can the will to value eclipse Nietzsche's will to power as a principle of life? The reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 8. So last week we discussed the possibility of criteria for the priority or even the primacy of value. We concluded with the principle of the will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. Yet I expressed ambivalence in using the notion of will in the idea of the will to value. The will to value might then be better expressed as an affirmation or value of value. This concern is the topic for today, examined in relation to Nietzsche's notion of the will to power. We can examine this concern about an overemphasis of the will in Nietzsche, who takes it much further. The notion of the will to power is also criticized by others such as Heidegger and Bertrand Dreyfus. Yet the idea of power is taken up by postmodernists like Michel Foucault, and the will to power, interpreted later as a will to will, also prefigures my own notion of the will to value. Yet these options are a result of the collapse of traditionally objective values and principles. So we are faced with the question of what should we will or value? Some fundamental options are a will to power, will to will to truth, or will to value. Yet we begin with the background as well as an analysis of Nietzsche's will to power. In order to provide the concept of will with context, we can go back to Kant's three faculties of mind. These were ekonnen, empfinden, and wollen, or in English, cognition, feeling, and will. Analytic philosophy typically reduces this to cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement this classification with the four states of cognition, affect, will, and value. We can also compare these categories of cognition, affect, will, and value with Sartre's constitution of the ego. He describes the ego as constituted by the three faculties of states, qualities, and action. Sartre explains that his states are affect states like hate, love, and jealousy. He describes qualities as an ensemble of virtues, latent traits, and potentialities. His omission of cognition might be taken as having been presupposed. But we may wonder how Sartre can incorporate action, which is physical, into a constitution of the ego. Again, we could suppose that action is an embodied will, as his later affinity with praxis might suggest. I previously argued that value has been neglected. This is borne out by the categories of Kant, Sartre, and analytic philosophy. But despite the emphasis on the will in Teutonic, Nietzschean, and existential thought, some ambiguity also seems to be evident above, also with respect to the will. Yet emphasis and ambiguity can be mutually implicative rather than mutually exclusive. In his work All Things Shining, Bertrand Dreyfus criticizes this emphasis or overemphasis of the will. He criticizes Kantian, Nietzschean, and Sartrean autonomy that seeks to impose itself upon the world. He singles out the author David Foster Wallace as imposing meaning upon life in acts of will and control. Dreyfus regards this as ultimately an unlivable, indiscriminate and obtuse response to life. Conversely, the meaning of events cannot viably be either accepted or simply given. They must be reinterpreted and chosen or rejected according to our best judgments. And the will is an aspect of this choice as well as its possible object. Yet the will is an essential aspect of the mind. The question is thereby one of interpretation and balance. And like Kant, Nietzsche, existentialists, and even the academic world have laid stress on the will. For the post-Nietzschean yet pre-existentialist Charles Gray Shaw, the will pervades his thinking. That is, for Shaw, values are volitional and happiness and joy must be willed. Yet Nietzsche's emphasis on the will, as the will to power, go beyond Kant and Teutonic thinking. For Hegel, the actualization of the will was expressed in the absolute spirit working itself out in the world. For Schopenhauer, this was expressed in his work, The World as Will and Representation. In my view, these views are anthropomorphic, yet Nietzsche was influenced by their thinking. So Nietzsche's view of the will to power went beyond human life as a pervasive force in all biological life. He even speaks of, I quote, a will to power in the organic processes. And he goes on to talk about the will to power as a primeval tendency of the protoplasm. Nietzsche seems to be no longer talking about the human dimension of mind and value. Yet in our comparison between Nietzsche's will to power and the will to value, we should see how far we can go. And taking this line, power might justifiably be seen as an organism's control over the environment. And the will to power might also be seen as control over one's own body and the movement of one's limbs. But as a biological drive, the will to power is excluded as a moral principle by arguments like Hume's and More's. And this explains how Nietzsche is often thought to be tainted by naturalism that is ruled out of moral values. Yet as selection and control, the will to power can be seen as compatible with other kinds of value. That is, animals have desires expressed in instincts, reproduction, hunger, and the avoidance of pain that are values. The fact that these feelings are genetically induced does not mean that they are not feelings or values. More refined animal values are found in capuchin perceptions of fairness and elephants' mourning. Of course, humans are capable of both a wider range of values and of affirming values and of valuing value. Yet the notion of animal values extends the scope of value to all conscious creatures. I've previously done this by extending the ontology of value to choice, selection and consciousness. And the genealogy of the will to value in humans continues in the activities of seeking meaning, self-esteem, pride, moral self-appraisal and value seeking. But this is an overgenerous interpretation of Nietzsche for the purpose of relating the will to power to value. Heidegger rejected Nietzsche's will to power as a result of the subjectivity prevalent in modern philosophy. Heidegger also regarded the will to power as overbearing in not allowing being to reveal itself, and he believed that the will to power could only be viably interpreted as the will to will. Yet Nietzsche himself endorses the will to will as a conclusion to his three metamorphoses of the spirit. The camel bears the burden of knowledge, the lion fights for truth and freedom, and the child proclaims in innocence a sacred yes as a free spirit that wills its own will. The will to power is also related to the will to will, because to will something is to want to bring it into existence. That is, to have the power to bring it into existence, and in that sense to control and dominate it. The idea of the will to will is endorsed and discussed by Sartre as well as by Heidegger and Nietzsche. And in this usage, the will can be regarded as either a provisional or, less convincingly, a final objective. Yet the function of the will in other mental states, in different degrees, is more credible. We saw, for example, that for sure values are volitional. The question is, to what extent? We can, for example, see that both the will and value are implied by wanting as an acquisitive capacity of the mind. Loving and hating are affective states that express positive and negative capacities of the will, and the will and value are employed by choice as a selective capacity. But given these and other relations between will, value, and value as a human objective discussed elsewhere, we can ask why did Nietzsche advocate the will to power instead of a will to value? One view is that the will to power is an overcompensation of weakness that Nietzsche suffered. Another is that he was influenced by Hegel, Schopenhauer, and others, as noted earlier. His disregard of the will to truth is another question that we can address shortly. Yet commentators Clark and Dudrick claim to have found what they name the will to value in Nietzsche's work. They point to Nietzsche's reference to a magnificent tension of the soul that they call the will to value. The tension is between wanting to see the world as it is and wanting to see it in terms of one's ideals. They see this as a tension between Nietzsche's will to truth and the will to value. But neither of these concepts are explicit in Nietzsche's works. Yet the associations between Nietzsche's will to power, will, and value are extremely strong. We saw that the motivating purpose of the will is value, and this relates value to the will and to power. Moreover, Nietzsche is quintessentially a philosopher of value as seen in his writings, and this implies the possibility of interpreting his key concepts in terms of value. The idea of tensions between Nietzsche's will to truth and the will to value and the will to power is an interesting one. There are strong indications in Nietzsche's thinking of both affirmations of truth and its disregard. On one hand, his three metamorphoses of the spirit affirm knowledge and truth, and such is also found in his affirmation of life, in his yea sayings, a sacred yes, and amor fati. His amor fati is a reconciliation of coming to terms with the facts of life as they are. On the other hand, Nietzsche questions the value of truth, which has been previously presupposed. We have since come to see different theories of truth, which render it as another anthropocentric concept. And Nietzsche finds a malevolence of reason in Socrates' perverse equation of reason with virtue. He also famously wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations, and that facts do not exist, only interpretations." In this view, Nietzsche predates postmodernism in leading away from moral facts and objectivity. yet he was also constructing an array of alternative values and an aesthetic justification of the world. And further to this view, the idea of constructing or creating values adds to his subjectivity. He writes that whatever has value in our world now does not have value in itself, but has been given value, and it was we who gave it and bestowed it. Only we have created a world that concerns man. So a simplistic account of Nietzsche's conception of truth as either realist or non-realist isn't adequate. In this respect, we can refer to Bernard Williams' admonishment of deniers of truth, while at the same time finding him quoting Donald Davidson saying that truth is, as G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege maintained and Alfred Tarski proved, an indefinable concept. Yet, as I have previously argued, the indefinability of both truth and the highest human good is fortuitous. It is fortuitous because truth and the highest good share a property which recommend them as values, and that property is possibility or absence, which beckons value to further value in the will to value. The highest human goods have traditionally been thought of as either ethical or religious, yet Nietzsche views the will to truth in religion as the seed of its own destruction in Christianity. Nietzsche's critiques of truth and ethics are entwined with religion that regards as the foundation of morality, but he contrasts religion with the master morality of heroic cultures expressing the will to power, and he regards Christianity as having a slave morality, unable to affirm positive values of life. Nietzsche's argument is that the weak are unable to achieve or even aspire to the values of the strong. The weak are thereby driven to value what they can aspire to instead of what they can't aspire to. These are values of weakness like humility, obedience, suffering, poverty, and acceptance. The values of strength and weakness are thereby inverted. Power is exchanged for weakness. The common criticism of religion is that worship of God diminishes the value of man, seeing himself as nothing. Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity is that it's sour grapes of the weak, unable to achieve virtues of strength. Yet Nietzsche had an ambivalent view of Christianity, decrying the religion but often praising the person of Christ. And he delivers a twist in his story about the will being repressed and turned against positive values. Firstly, the will to power is still expressed, but perversely in negative ways. Secondly, these negative impulses can't be directed externally, so are redirected towards oneself. This creates classic self-blame, religious guilt, and bad conscience, or ressentiment, as Nietzsche calls it. But internally directed guilt has another effect of turning human beings into a new kind of creature. The former paradigm was one of I and thou, that of assuming my ways are good, yours are bad. But now guilt opens a fissure within the self, beyond the binary I am good, you are bad. A new moral creature is born, held in tension between guilt and self-interest. Ethics and religion are essentially prescriptive theories telling us what we ought to do. The question now is whether Nietzsche's will to power is a prescriptive or descriptive theory. That is it telling us what to do, or is it just reporting a state of affairs. Prescriptivism is a different theory of R.M. Hare, that language expresses values that have prescriptive implications. Philippa Foot followed with descriptivism, that it is an empirical fact that a value is an empirical fact. I myself have employed both descriptive and prescriptive approaches to a theory of value. I've already presented value here as a descriptive principle in human activities as an aspect of consciousness. The prescriptive principle of value I want to introduce, of course, is the principle of the will to value. And we can first think about the will to power similarly as having these two aspects. But we should first note that Nietzsche's will to power is naturalistic in a way that prevents prescriptive claims. His affinity to power led him to view the will to power as a pervasive force in all biological life. But as a biological drive, the will to power is excluded as a moral principle. Nietzsche's critique of ethics and religion are also descriptive because they are both historical and psychological. He looks to history to show the all too human origins of religious values. He looks to psychology to show the negative impulses that underlie apparently moral motives. And he describes psychology as the royal road to understanding morals. Nietzsche was also adamant in wanting to replace orthodox morality with aesthetic justification. He repeated several times that the existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. And on this view, moral judgments are replaced with aesthetic judgments such as likes and dislikes. But on the other hand, his descriptive or aesthetic judgments had the insistence and vigour of moral judgments. His value preferences are obvious in holding the master morality over slave morality. Strong values are also found in his affirmation of life, in his yea sayings, a sacred yes and amor fati. And preference is further evident for mankind's creation of his own values. Much of Nietzsche's account is ostensibly descriptive, but there is a prescriptive subtext. Something similar can also be said about Michel Foucault. Foucault also uses the concept of power as an explanatory principle in human life and society. But Foucault's preferences and his disdain of abuses of power are well known. There are comparisons and contrasts to be made here between Nietzsche and Foucault's attitudes to power. Both have descriptive and prescriptive elements with different attitudes to power. Like Foucault, and indeed myself, Heidegger is more critical of employment of power. Heidegger can only see a viable interpretation of the will to power as the will to will, and as previously argued, the will to will can be further interpreted as the will to value. But before reviewing that interpretation, we can say something about power as an object of our will. 2 weeks ago, we examined a number of different possible objectives like that of power. These objectives were broadly placed in the 4 categories of cognition, affect, will and value. Particular objectives considered were consciousness, knowledge, truth, happiness and the will. As for the will, we saw that it is part of a process or means towards an end, so it is idiosyncratic as a human objective. The will is a vehicle of action or motivation rather than a constitutive state or even an objective. And for these reasons, the will to will can't be an adequate or definitive human objective. With respect to power, like those other ideals, we must ask whether it can be an end or an intrinsic value in itself. And for similar reasons, as well as an insufficiently deep analysis, power can't be an end in itself. Power is a capability of something, not a mental state, and as such can't be valuable in itself. And we have to ask, why is power pursued, and what lies beyond the pursuit of power? Apart from blind genetic impulse, I propose that what lies beyond power is value. And in order to outline that case, I can briefly review the criteria for value as an objective that I outlined last week. These were coherence, consistency, quality, choice, truth, and crucially, self-validation and sufficiency. One of the ways of explaining coherence was with Moore's and Nozick's view of intrinsic value as organic unity. Consistency was explained as reduction of psychological, ontological and theoretical gaps or fissures. The idea of truth as a valid criterion drew on a certain symmetry between truth, value and moral value. That is, they both not only have inescapable claims on their will, but they are both indeterminable. And that indeterminability provided an absence and possibility to will value to further value. Self-validation of value arose in two ways. One was its inherent quality and satisfactoriness. Another was that not to value value is contradictory, self-negating, self-defeating and erroneous. Yet the adequacy, satisfactoriness and sufficiency of value are insufficient and need the support of cognitive frameworks. This support produces a dialectic between value states and various supporting conceptions of things. But these criteria and others we don't have time to mention are largely subject to choice. Some are not subject to choice because they are entrenched in genetic, social or ideological edifices. And many of them can only have significance if we're aware of them and if they are chosen. And we can also reject or affirm them on our best judgments. And those best judgments are informed by discussions such as these. So in conclusion, does the will to value eclipse Nietzsche's will to power as a principle of life? We saw that Nietzsche's will to power is over-inclusive, naturalistic and possibly Teutonic. Heidegger also rejects Nietzsche's will to power as overbearing, and he interprets it as the will to will. These and other arguments seem to weigh against the will to power. Yet the idea of power and the will to power has made contributions towards our understanding of life. Foucault was perhaps motivated by Nietzsche to examine power as a problem in social and political life. Given these considerations, why did Nietzsche advocate the will to power rather than the will to value? Ideology, history and psychology have been suggested to explain Nietzsche's affinity to power. And the will to power can be criticized on moral, psychological and cultural grounds. Yet the notion of power isn't completely without merit, especially as a means of redressing a religious veneration of weakness. Interpretations of the will to power by Heidegger, Nietzsche himself and myself also led to its derivations. These derivations were the will to will and the will to value, also acclaimed by Clarke and Dudrick. and the tension they found in Nietzsche is a feature of both value and the will to value. This also indicates a relation between the will to power, the will to will, and the will to value. Yet the plausibility of the will to power as a comprehensive human principle can be seen in another sense. That is, the will to power can be seen as control over one's own body and over the environment, and such is evident in animals, expressed in instincts, reproduction, hunger, and the avoidance of pain. And these will be expressed as desires that are a kind of values even for animals. And the idea of animal values extends the scope of value to all conscious creatures. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on a website like Zoom or meetup.com.